My name is Montia D Gardner. I am originally from Gary, Indiana, and I am currently a doctoral student at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County in the Language, Literacy, and Culture Department.
Outstanding. Tell me a little bit about your family background.
So I spent the last summer archiving the census records and taking a really deep dive into the paternal side of my family. And I can trace my ancestry back to a slave on the Whitfield plantation in North Carolina named Hagar White Whitfield. She matriculated or in some way came to Mississippi early in the 1800s along with a Monroe Prentice who would have a son named Lexington Prentice who would marry my great-great-great-grandmother Hagar White Whitfield. To their union would be 13 children. Of them would have been my great-great-grandmother Dora Prentice, who ended up taking care of her other 13 siblings when her mother died in childbirth, having the last child. That Dora would then have a Dora who would marry John Gardner, who was a resident of Mississippi, Warren County in Vicksburg, Mississippi at the time. And to that union would be 9, of which my grandfather, Alandris Gardner Sr., would be born. Alandris Gardner Sr. was the second boy of 9 siblings, all of which resided in Warren County at the time, and then a majority of them came to Gary, Indiana in the 1950s. And of course, that is where my father was born. And so a lot of the history that I have about my family dated back to census records and then stories that were able to be pieced together and then validated looking at different sources such as birth and death records. I found that a lot of the members of my family had died early in their infancy, and so the records are there. I also found that my great-great-grandfather Lexington Prentice was committed to an insane asylum by his brother shortly after his wife died in childbirth, not really understanding the grief that he was dealing with. And so there's a huge story wrapped around a lot of that, and I'm digging a lot deeper to find out the connections that I can make.
I have a question on this piece of paper that seems obvious, but maybe not so much, but I'll ask it anyway.
Sure.
How does doing the research on your family history help you in the area of health and wellness? So,
in the area of mental wellness, it has been the bomb in Gilead, because I would be a first-generation PhD student out of my family, the first in my family to have a PhD, and it's a very trying task. It gets hard, very hard. And because I'm limited in the resources, family resources or connections that I have with people who already have a PhD, you find yourself really isolated. And so going back into my history and connecting stories to the women in my family, their struggles, helped me know that they once charted new territory. And so it is the reason why my family lineage is strong right now. And so I really pull from their strength just by watching and listening and paying attention and watching the records and the stories kind of coincide with each other. It gives me a lot of strength. And it is that strength that I think of when I get overwhelmed. I think of my great-grandmothers as the 4 posters on my bed that guard me at night, but then continue to give me this wisdom and impart to me everything I need in order to keep going in this process. So that is the most important part of looking into that history.
What are things, in your opinion, that people running for office today in either party should be looking at? And what would you ask them if you could?
So because my work is steeped in education and the education of disenfranchised students, I have a real issue with the topic not being discussed fully, because the next generation of people who will make choices for this country are going to come out of our school systems in some way, or not make decisions about this country, or be completely pushed out of the voting process or the decision-making process as time goes along. And so if I was going to ask a question about those who are running for office right now, I would want to know, how are you going to find equity in education for all students? How is it that we're going to make sure that poor students and those who are wealthy have the same education and the same opportunities? Because that is where the great divide begins to happen. As soon as a child gets in kindergarten and what's taught in one school is not available in another, there is where the crack happens. And then over those 12 years, as they go up, that crack widens until now you have a Grand Canyon of differences between the low income and the disadvantaged and those who come from a wealthy background. So I would like to know how we are going to find equity in our school system, and not by throwing money at it. I'm talking about really deep diving into culturally responsive teaching and making sure teachers are represented in the classrooms and paid equitable for the amount of work that they do, and really trying to make sure that schools are proper edifices for children to learn.
Theoretically speaking, let's say you spoke to a candidate that you were pleased with. How would you encourage others in your community to ensure that they're registered and that they are voting?
So I'm a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and of course one of our major missions is voting. And so if you would repeat the second part of that question again, I think I missed the second part.
How would you encourage those in your community to be sure that they're registered and get out the vote?
All right, so there are two platforms that I think are very important for voter turnout, especially in the urban community. One is, I think, is the Black church, which it is important that who our representations are in the Black church are sharing the message of our history more than their political candidate, but sharing the message of our history in voting to ensure that people understand the importance of it. And so I think one of the biggest platforms to getting people in our communities to vote is, of course, the Black church. But I think the other thing is just really getting out in the streets, like that foot traffic, that going door to door, that making sure we create opportunities and events where we know people will come, and then using that as our platform to talk about voting. Whether it's sponsoring a movie for families, going in and speaking to seniors who will be 18 before the voting happens. So through the Black church, and also through creating opportunities for people to gather together so that the conversation about voting can happen.